Jonathan is a child that lives in a family with 7 brothers and 3 sisters. He's the 3rd Jonathan in the family because 2 Jonathans before him had passed away with limited resources and limited access to different things that he needed to do to survive. Ladies and gentlemen, it might sound far-fetched, but this is the reality for thousands and hundreds of thousands of individuals in lower socioeconomic countries struggling because of overpopulation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm the Prime Minister, and I'd like to start off by defining the debate, and the resolution is that this House believes that countries with booming populations should introduce tradable child permits. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this House is Canada. We're speaking on behalf of Canada, and what we would define a booming population is a population growing at a rate that's not sustainable for a good quality of life. And we would do things to measure this, such as quarterly surveys asking how your life was before, how your life is now, and how you see it going to be in the future. We think this is a viable method of tracking the success rate. Also, we define child permits as a system set up such that a mother can have 2 tradable permits, and the process of trading them would be facilitated through the government. That's just the way that we see this going, and we see this being the most effective. Now, what am I going to do for you today, ladies and gentlemen? First off, I'm going to start by showing why it's needed and why it needs to be done this way, and furthermore, the benefits of this passing. That's the short term. Now, first of all, why it's needed. Well, I hope that you got from my introduction that this is a very strong, terrible problem affecting those of thousands and if not millions, ladies and gentlemen. There are kids starving with diseases and no access to any medical attention because there's such a strain on the population, ladies and gentlemen. There's countries, civilizations that are struggling because there's just too many people, and it's growing at an ever-growing rate. The problem is terrible, and it's at its peak right now, which is why drastic measures need to be taken at this moment. Now, why does it need to be done this way? Well, I sort of just touched on it, ladies and gentlemen. It needs to happen now. People are struggling, people are dying because of lack of access to food and medicine, and it's because there's so many people growing at a rate. We can do things like increasing the amount of accessibility for contraceptives and trying to increase education. We would do that alongside a resolution, ladies and gentlemen, but we think that it's such an important and pending problem right now that we have to take the most drastic measure. Furthermore, we see that this system has actually worked in different places in the world. If you look to China actually implemented this, and they completely decreased the rate of population growth. They actually got it to a point that was sustainable, and now they're going to take it away. For the first time in I don't know how long, now Chinese people can have more than 2 children. And that's because they stabilized the population, they increased the education in people, and they made the situation better. Now, what are the benefits of this in the short term? Well, in the short term, governments can actually reallocate resources that they before had no ability to achieve. Before, where they would have been spending it on things like social structures, trying to stabilize a population, now it's stabilized, ladies and gentlemen, at a rate that it never was before. And we can use this money to put it back into the communities, increasing things like education, increasing things like access to contraceptives, where you wouldn't be able to before with no money. Those are just the short-term benefits, ladies and gentlemen. Now, on the long term, we don't have to do this forever. We see this as a very dire problem now. In the long term, ladies and gentlemen, we can take this away, and at that point, our populations would be educated and be at a sustainable rate where the government can actually monitor them and can actually help them. We can remove it once the population is educated enough to. But ladies and gentlemen, if we do nothing and we simply throw pills at them now, we're going to be stuck into a fate where thousands, if not millions of children will continue to die because of inaccess to things like education and medicine. Ladies and gentlemen, it's for these reasons and the reasons that my partner will bring up that we on Side Government are so proud to propose.
I call the first speaker for the opposition. Mr. Speaker, what a moving story we just heard from the Honorable Prime Minister. The situation he laid out is definitely a very real and visceral one for many people in this world. It makes me think of another systemic issue that society faces, a grave one. The problem of cancer. We know that medical issues like cancer can have horrible, far-reaching, diverse, and hard to anticipate effects on society. It can ruin a family. I would equate what the government is proposing to chemotherapy. Chemotherapy is not a solution to cancer. It is a treatment. It is a situational fix to a systemic problem. Now the difference is, of course, we should use chemotherapy as a way to mitigate the effects of cancerous cells, as a way to minimize cancerous growth in a body. But what else does chemotherapy do at the same time? Is there not something that if we were to stumble upon would cause us to throw chemotherapy to the wind? I think there is, and we are striving towards it. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister spoke about measuring success of an implemented program to employ a child voucher system. If they are so certain that this drastic measure is what is necessary in today's society, why bother measuring success? If they were to conduct quarterly surveys and have unfavorable results, do we stop the program? Why stop at child vouchers? What's really the problem? Why is unsustainable population growth an issue today? Can we not look deeper to the underlying cause of this problem and begin there, and slowly roll out a measured and measurable solution that we can iterate, innovate, improve, build upon? Once you go to child vouchers, it's very hard to come back. In fact, why even have child vouchers at all? Why not just sterilize the population once they hit their maximum? That would be slightly more effective, perhaps. I think it would tackle the problem that an undeniable black market for child vouchers would spring forth from such a drastic measure as the government has proposed. Why not just sterilize? I'll tell you why we're not going to sterilize our own population. Because it infringes and impedes in the most drastic way upon individual rights and freedoms. In Canada and around the world, this is a thought that populations have foisted. Yes?
Can you point out specific ways that it didn't work in China?
Well, let's read a little bit about what happened in China. I'm sure many of the people in this room have done so. Yes, population growth and unsustainability was curbed. But can the government prove that this was a direct result from the program? Was it not economic stabilization, social stabilization, cultural innovation, global competition? China right now, go ahead.
Can you explain how these effects, such as cultural advantage?
I believe the burden of proof is upon yourself to prove the opposite. So as I had mentioned, this is far too drastic and severe of a solution for, yes, a deeply systemic and underlying problem. But side opposition would propose Let's use what we have at our disposal without sacrificing our individual rights and freedoms that not only Canadians, but the world hold so dear. Let's implement a program that we can measure and improve, not one that is binary yes or no. For these reasons, the resolution must fall.
Talk to the second member of government.
I don't know what time it is.
5:30, you were pretty good. Mr. Speaker, side government has some issues that they would like to bring up regarding points that side opposition has brought before the House today. First of all, their story comparing our solution and resolution to that of cancer, saying that chemotherapy is not a solution and that we are trying to implement this two-child situation right now for the greater good in the long run, and explaining how their analogy doesn't quite fit with what we are trying to get at. We are trying to explain as side government that there is a problem now, Mr. Speaker. We have an issue presently that needs to be dealt with. The issue of cancer is a side story. It is somewhat similar, but it doesn't quite explain where we need to get at this point. We are trying our best here to measure success. We have come up with an idea that is sustainable in the moment. They're asking us, why bother measuring this? What happens if this doesn't work? What happens if we see that the overall happiness and welfare of this population itself is not increasing? Guess what? We stop the program and we find another solution. But for right now, Mr. Speaker, this is where we need to be. Right now, the points that side opposition has brought before the House today are not strong. I am not quite sure where they were trying to go with their resolution. I am not sure what points they were trying to bring up, but it was not quite certain. Yes?
Arguing by assertion that our points are not strong. Can you elaborate?
It's not the fact that side opposition, Mr. Speaker, has not brought clear points as to where they are trying to go. They're not refuting or coming up with any idea or a better solution necessarily than our
I thought it was pretty
individual
clear,
right.
measured.
They keep telling us to measure success. They are also saying that, you know, the underlying cause. What is the underlying cause of the issue? Let's find the underlying cause. But Mr. Speaker, side opposition has not told us what the underlying cause is, and we are trying to find that for ourselves. We know by fact that increased populations are not allowing the overall population in society to have the resources that they need. People are still living in poverty and not able to access necessarily clean water, enough food, education, or other social benefits. You know, we are sitting here as well, and side government is slightly confused because we brought up the example of China. And this situation has worked for China. And we know that because of statistical reasoning and facts that China in general has been able to implement this and come back from it and have an overall increase in the happiness and welfare of the population, the GDP. And even though their numbers have increased, that is not what we are saying. We are not saying that the countries that have a booming increase in the numbers of people living in that country is the issue. We are saying the countries that can no longer sustain the means of life. That is what we are talking about, Mr. Speaker. We would like to know ultimately what program, what other solution that side opposition is willing to bring to the table. Because we have a problem right now. And my colleague has brought up to the table that we need to do this for the greater good. But I would like to talk a little bit about some of the other issues and why this is necessary for us to bring about the House today. Ultimately, along with the reasoning of the burden that we are putting upon the rest of society, we have to think about the economics, the tax system, the political system, and by implementing this two-child permit to each individual who has come to their menstrual cycle, or to puberty necessarily, how can we do this and why is this important? Well, we can come up with a selective market mechanism that is going to allow the economies to be able to understand why this is important and why we need to have a two-person system. So let's think of it this way. A lot of these societies, a lot of the countries with this booming population where they cannot sustain life to reasonable means, necessarily and not always, there is a governmental system in place, a political system, that is not allowing for the proper allocation of resources. These people are, the governments are taking money and necessarily keeping the rich rich and the poor poor. And we need a means to be able to allocate funds so that everyone has equal rights here in the situation and equal resources. By implementing this two-person system, we are about, yes?
By tradable, one person gets 3 children, one person gets 1. I fail to see how that's equal.
One person gets 3, one person gets 1. There's still a 2-to-2 ratio regardless of who's possessing these means. So, yes?
Person by person, parents, 3 is not equal to 1.
Do we want to use a different word? Can we say instead of equity, maybe equality, if that makes anything better? We're not necessarily saying, at the end of the day, if you want to talk about an allocation of 3-to-1 or 2-to-2, we are saying that 2 + 2 equals 4 and 3 + 1 equals 4. We are still dealing with the issue, Mr. Speaker, of the population increase. The overall statistics of the means are still going to stand. We need to also remember this, that again, as I was saying, with the democratic systems, we are not properly allocating resources. So if we were to do this on a per person basis, yes, maybe someone with 3 children is getting slightly more money. They have 1 extra person to feed. What about the situation of someone with 1 child? Maybe they're getting a little less because they have 1 less person to have to care for. This is what we are trying to get at, Mr. Speaker. And additionally, the last point that we want to bring up that is still important to this case but not one of the bigger arguments in our reasoning is moral decision. By implementing this 2-person situation for right now, we want to discuss the idea that this will allow to more bound rational thinking. People are not having children for the sake of having children. They're going to have these children because they want to have these children, and there's more of a thought process behind it. And last but not least, we would like to explain, and this might have not been made clear, but I would like to bring this to the House now, Mr. Speaker, is that this is going to be, this 2-person tax is going to be implemented now, but that does not mean it needs to hold for a lifetime. We could say in the 5 to 10 year term until we resolve the booming population situation. And if it does not get resolved in that time period, Mr. Speaker, we will still make sure that we find another means to deal with this. Thank you.
Thank you. I call upon the second speaker for side opposition.
Don't focus on this yours.
So, Mr. Speaker, the government's argument is essentially that there is suffering now and that we have to implement an immediate fix in order to curb that suffering. However, the reality is that these things are, it's not the suffering can't just be fixed by a situational fix. It's a systemic problem. So it's kind of like alcohol. Alcohol causes a lot of problems in our society. We could ban it right now, and yeah, it would infringe on some people's freedoms, their freedom to drink alcohol, but it would save lives, right? It would stop drunk drivers from, killing people in accidents. However, why don't we do that? Well, when we did do that, people didn't listen. The ban didn't work. Not only was it not effective because it infringed on people's rights, but it ended up getting overturned anyway. And their argument, their counter to this is that, well, we could just do it now and get rid of it later once people kind of, calm down a bit, maybe realize that having so many children isn't the best thing. But that's a huge thing to implement. That is a huge evil, essentially. You're saying that these people are being restricted in their ability to have children. You're just saying, let's just try having tradable child permits, and then, well, we'll fix it later down the road. If we're gonna suggest implementing this solution, then we kind of have to think about those impacts. We kind of have to think about what this ban is going to do. Al Capone, the only reason he's famous is because of bootlegging. He literally made all his money off bootlegging. He committed the Valentine's Day massacre, killing, I think, like 22 people. So if we had thought about maybe, okay, well, or the criminal activity is going to, yeah.
Since I didn't hear it from the leader of the opposition, can you explain how this policy didn't work specifically in China?
Well, it did work, but again, it created a lot of evils. People were killing their children because they were women. So you could say, yeah, it might work for a bit, but if we're going to have all this other bad stuff that's happening, maybe we should think about putting something like this in place. Where if you compare that to education and contraceptives, which the government has agreed is a good idea, and said they would implement it in the policy itself, why don't we just do that? It would be less heavy-handed, more culturally acceptable, and frankly might be more effective.
Point of information.
Yeah.
Side government has brought to the table that we would like to introduce contraceptive and education, but there's a problem right now that we need to deal with. So we need to figure out something immediately and still go on for the short term.
But do we need to fix something right away? Do you think these societies like India and China, well, India specifically, obviously China's already gone through it, but do you think they would see implementing such a thing as a greater good? For a lot of these people, having children is part of the quality of life. If they didn't have a family, if they only had 2 children or were restricted, or even worse, if they're poor and they're forced to sell these child permits, do you think that they're going to see this as a good thing? Even if down the road they've evolved as a society and they're able to sustain their population, how is that beneficial to them and a good thing? They're seeing it's a huge evil that's being imposed on their societies. So we shouldn't just do something immediately and fix it, even though it might solve a bit of it right away. If we put in softer, more systemic fixes to the issue, it'll actually create greater good over a long period of time and won't impose these huge amounts of evil on a society. And again, you said it yourself, why don't we start with something like clean water, food, and education? If we look at Western societies and developing countries, they have better education, more access to basic rights, and their women on their own choose to have less children. Whereas in Africa, they don't even name some of their children because their infant mortality rate is so high, and they know that they're not going to survive as long. So if we can see that as countries develop more and more, it leads to this automatic behavior, why force it? Isn't that such a huge policy to implement? Why not just improve their access to basic rights?
You brought up an example of Africa, but we would like to say people are having children and multiple children and lots of children because of the mortality rates. So if we were to introduce these permits, would that not stop that issue?
Sure, it would, but it would also introduce a lot of bad stuff in their society that those societies wouldn't even agree themselves are a good thing. They wouldn't see this child permit as this saving feature that's going to improve their society. This is Canada and Western societies coming in saying, you need to live like this, you need to have children, only 2 children, for every woman, there can only be 2 children, and it's not going to be, they're not going to agree with it morally, even if it is effective. And the fact that is, if you introduce education and contraceptives, yeah, it's going to have a slower effect, but better overall, because you're not introducing these huge moral evils into their society that they're not going to want anyway.
That's forbidden, by the way.
Yeah, I don't know what that is. Sorry. But that's it, I guess.
You can't read my writing, or?
Oh, I guess. I can get my flat. Can you slow my spot?
Yeah, it's you.
We have 2 minutes and then we get down to real work. Come here. John, sit down.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to sum everything up today. I'm going to look at the point brought up by side opposition through this whole debate, our points, and furthermore, break it down into the main question of this debate. Which side decreases booming populations? That's what this debate is about. It's not about cancer. It's not about alcohol. It's not about any of that. We can sit around making analogies all day, and bluffing is good in debates, but you've got to do it to a certain extent. All right, let's look at the point. I want to say points, but the point brought up by side opposition. You know, it's kind of hard to analyze and put into points. We talked about sterilization, we talked about cancer, okay, but we also talked about, I think the main maybe point I can pull out of this is don't put a Band-Aid over a massive problem. It brings out bad stuff, it brings out bad evils, and that's a good thing to say. But
Thanks.
using your side, and I'm gonna try and assume this was your solution to the problem, which was education and introducing contraceptives. That's gonna take generations to solve the problem. That's generations of thousands, if not millions of children dying because of things like starvation, things like improper medical attention, because of the booming populations. You brought it up yourself, China. Well, you can't attribute their success just to the population tax. They also had a great economy. Well, we would say that is directly correlated with the tax itself, ladies and gentlemen. We think that those things were not possible if there was a race to the bottom with tens of 14 children per child, per mother, ladies and gentlemen. We don't think that would have been possible. Okay, the main question, which decreases population? We by default win this debate. We're the only side that's brought up a solution to the problem, ladies and gentlemen. We said we can do contraceptives, we said we can do education, but ladies and gentlemen, the problem's now. We need to fix it. This is why we've won the debate. Thank you.
Did you say this is why we've won the debate?
Yes.